Welcome to EV-olution. My name is Andre Lawrence and this is my channel about electric cars from the perspective of a first-time EV owner. When you think of the Kia Niro EV, you think that the related cousin is the Hyundai Kona Electric, but it's actually the Hyundai Ioniq Electric. If you want to know why, stick around, I'll let you know in 10 seconds. That's right, it's actually the Hyundai Ioniq that has the same platform as the Kia Niro EV. Now you may be thinking that's a little counterintuitive because this is a sedan versus the Niro that's a CUV or a crossover utility vehicle. I call it a station wagon. But essentially, the wheelbase is the same, whereas the Kona is actually much shorter. Now, if you want to see a side-by-side comparison of the Hyundai Kona Electric and the 2019 Kia Niro EV, I made a video in 2019 and I'll put a link somewhere up here on the screen for you to go check that out. Now, other than the fact that this is based on the same wheelbase or the same basic platform, there are some differences between the Ioniq and the Niro. The Niro has a 64 kilowatt hour battery pack, whereas the Hyundai Ioniq only has a 38 kilowatt hour battery pack. Now you might be able to tell from that intro that the Niro EV is actually a vehicle that's a little bit higher and also has a little bit more cabin space because of the overall design. This is more of a sedan, but you'd be surprised at how big the trunk is, and I'll show that to you in a second. But first, let's talk about that wheelbase. Just before I show you the comparison of the wheelbase side by side, I want to let you know that this is a 2020 Hyundai Ioniq Electric Ultimate Edition versus my 2019 Kia Niro EV SX Touring. So both are top trim, but the big difference is that I ride on 17-inch wheels, whereas the Ioniq has 16. That doesn't mean that it'll make a difference for the wheelbase, but it does change something in terms of ride height. Now you'll notice from the angle that you've got that the ride height is actually quite similar. The big difference is in terms of the actual car and how the platform on top, or the body on top, sits. The sedan is much lower, whereas the Niro EV is much higher. For now, let's look at the wheelbase. I'm just going to get to the back of the car and show you the completely non-scientific way of measuring the wheelbase. So you see that the Ioniq has the center hub here, which is pretty much lined up with the Niro's center hub. And then if I walk you up to the front of the cars, you've got the same measurement where the hub here lines up with the hub of the Niro. Now, if you reference that Kona video that I made in 2019, you'll notice that the lining up of the wheels showed that the Kona was substantially shorter. Now that means that the trunk space and the rear passenger room in the Kona, as well as the sole, because those are based on the same type of platform, are substantially less than in the Ioniq and in the Niro because of that extra wheelbase. So what about that trunk space that I was talking about? Let me show you what I mean. Like I mentioned, the trunk of the Ioniq is surprisingly large. Now let me open both of these up and show you. I've got a tape measure in the Niro, so we're gonna start by measuring the Niro, and then we'll measure the Ioniq and give you the comparison. You might be surprised, even though this car has a sloped rear hatch, there's a lot of room in there. So with regards to the Niro, if you watched my Kona comparison, you'll know that the Niro has quite a deep trunk. 30 and a quarter inches, and I'll put that in millimeters up on the screen here as well. Now with regards to width, the Niro has about 41 and a quarter inches. If we go over to the Hyundai Ioniq, one thing you might notice, it might be hard to see from over there, but from over here, this trunk is really deep and considerably deeper than the Niro. Now, I was a little surprised by that, but that is all because the overhang of the trunk is actually longer in the Ioniq than in the Niro. Let me show you what that measures out to be. Now, in terms of depth, the Ioniq actually has about 35 and a quarter inches. Now that was something that caught me off guard when I first measured. And then if you take the width, it has about 39 inches. So it's not as wide, but it's definitely much deeper. So overall trunk space in both of these cars is a lot bigger than the Kona, but the only real difference with regards to each other is going to be the height of certain items that you can put in the back of here because of this sloped rear hatch. Now you'll be able to see what I'm talking about if I close both of these and you have a look on that camera that's over there, and hopefully that gives you a decent idea. So with regards to trunk storage, the Ioniq may be a sedan, but it's surprisingly good. The advantage of the extra wheelbase not only gives you more trunk room than in the Kona Electric for the Hyundai Ioniq Electric, like in the Niro, but it also gives you rear passenger room that's a little more generous with regards to knee space. The main difference between the Niro and the Ioniq is actually the lower roofline and the car that rides a little bit lower. So anybody who's going to be 6 feet and higher might find this a little bit cramped. I'm 5'8". I'll put that in meters up on the screen, and I get about a fist's worth of space above my head in here. So I'm fine, but on a long trip, if you're really tall, maybe not the best. What did surprise me is that the Ioniq's floor seems to be a little bit lower than in the Niro EV, meaning that I have more thigh support when I'm seated and I place myself in a relaxed position. But the Niro's floor being a little bit higher, it means that I have to sit a little more spread eagle, which means that there's less room if you're 3 people in the car. So this actually wins in terms of long-term ride comfort, I think, because of that extra floor space. One thing that I did notice, or that I thought I noticed, is that I thought the Niro was wider in the back than in the Ioniq, but after measuring with the owner of the Ioniq, it's actually identical from bench side to bench side and from door sill to door sill. So it is pretty much the same thing. The difference comes from the bolsters on the side of the seats of the Niro, which give it an appearance of being wider, but the place where you actually sit is exactly the same. If you've watched my video about the things that I hate about my Kia Niro EV, and I'll put a link to that video somewhere up here on the screen, then you'll know that one of my biggest pet peeves is the fact that they put the charge port in the front. Now you can watch the video to get all the details as to why I hate that, but one of the biggest things is when you're driving and it's dirty or wet or snowy or slushy, that whole front of the car gets coated, and if it ices over, you're not opening that charge port very easily. Now on the Ioniq, they did the smart thing by putting it on the rear left, which is on the driver's side here in North America and many other countries. So that is, in my opinion, fantastic. Earlier in the video I said that these were almost identical, but I discovered a couple things with the owner of this car that show me that they're not as similar as you would think with regards to the hardware that makes them go. Now we know that the battery packs have different cells. The Niro uses SK Innovation, whereas the Hyundai uses LG Chem. But the fact that both of these companies are supplied by Mobis for their motors and reduction gears, etc., I was a little surprised to notice a difference with the owner of the car, that the motor actually sits quite a bit higher in the Ioniq than in the Niro, even though the Niro has a higher body and the Ioniq has a lower body. And that is a little bit surprising because the slope of the hood of the Ioniq is much lower than on the Niro, which is more the shape of a brick. Now let me show you what I mean up close and you'll get an idea. I'll just pull off the cover from both motors and you'll see A, the inverter is completely different, and B, the motor in the Niro sits really low. So when you look at the motor of the Ioniq, there's a big difference that you'll see when I show you the Niro. The motor is actually quite high and almost flush with the hood, especially when you put that cover back on. And that was a bit of a surprise. Now let me give you a close-up look of the actual overall inverter. And now let's go over to the Niro and have a look at what that looks like. Now the first thing you'll notice is that the inverter and the entire assembly in the Niro is much, much lower, and that's not just because of the body and the shape of the Niro. We measured from an opening down in the bottom, somewhere down there if you can see that, with a tape measure, and the Niro's top of the inverter actually sits about 3.5, 4 inches lower than in the Ioniq, which is a huge surprise. Now you'll also notice that the inverter here is square, whereas in the Ioniq there is a notch in the top left. So this is definitely a different construction. Now I have seen the 2020 Niro and it has an identical layout as my 2019, so it isn't a question of the year. Now there are advantages to having these two differences in design. The Hyundai Ioniq is actually the efficiency king other than Tesla when it comes to power use, as opposed to the Niro, which is pretty good, but definitely not in Ioniq range. Now that we've had a look at the rest of the Ioniq, what about the driver's seat? What's different and what's the same as compared to the Kia Niro EV? Now, one thing to note, this is a 2020 model that has the 10.25-inch touchscreen. Mine has the 8-inch touchscreen because it's a 2019 model year that didn't have 10.25-inch available. But I have made a comparison video of the Kia Niro EV 2019 versus 2020. If you're interested in seeing that, I'll put a link up on the screen here for you to check that out after. But the 2020 Niro EV does have the integrated 10.25-inch touchscreen, so I'm in a good position to compare it. All of the rest is pretty much the same. Let's start with this door. Now, the driver door of the Ioniq has the seat memory buttons in a bit of a different place, but everything is pretty much identical as compared to the Niro EV. The next thing to look at is the buttons on the side of the dash, which are also fairly identical. The big difference here is that you've got a charge port cover release button, which is spring-loaded, as opposed to the Niro, which is just a push door. If we look at the steering wheel, the Ioniq steering wheel has a flat bottom. The Niro does not, but everything else is laid out in the same position with these buttons, the flappy paddles in the back for the regen, as well as the stalks for the lights and the wipers. Now, one thing that's also very interesting is although the instrument cluster is different in the Ioniq, the menus are all identical to the Kia product. So the Soul, the Ioniq, and the Kona and the Niro all have these same menus and options. So if you're driving one and you mess with the settings, you'll be very familiar. Something else that's different in this car as compared to the Niro is the shifter. In the Ioniq, the shifter is actually touch buttons, and when I test drive the car, it's something that messed me up when I initially tried it out. The other thing that's to note that's different is the seats in this car are not ventilated, they're only heated. Everything else is fairly similar. The wireless charger for the phone is right here. The Niro has it hidden in a cubby underneath the climate control. Which leads me to the other main difference is the climate control in this car. Even though the screen here is a big difference, the buttons themselves are tactile as opposed to being physical buttons like we have in the Niro. Now let me give you a close-up look at these. There you go. It's all tactile buttons. The menus on this screen are actually quite similar as to the menus in the Niro. They're actually almost identical to mine, and that's the 2019. The 2020 is pretty much the same. You'll notice that Hyundai has Blue Link, whereas Kia has UVO. Other than that, this is essentially the same as in the Niro. The look is a little bit different. The next thing to have a look at is the mirror. This mirror is actually identical to the mirror in my Niro. It has all the same buttons and the same layout. And then you've got the overhead console that has a very similar design for the sunroof button and the dome lights. So that's it for the driver's seat. There are some pretty big differences for the 2020 Niro EV and Ioniq, but there are also a lot of things that are very similar and common and shared between the two companies. But now, how does it drive as compared to the Niro EV? Now that we've had a quick tour of the differences between the Ioniq and the Niro, what do I think it drives like as compared to my car? Now, the car's position in terms of seating height is a little bit lower, so there is definitely a difference with regards to the overall ride height of the car. So here we go. One of the things that I notice is that the interior is, although Hyundai and different in terms of some of the layout, still very familiar with regards to the buttons in the door and some of the other things in the car. Now, even though this car does have a smaller battery, you still feel that extra weight, and you definitely know that you're riding in an electric car. Now, the fact that this car has the smaller battery pack means that it's also got the smaller motor. That means that it has a little bit less power with regards to acceleration, torque, and horsepower, but it drives remarkably similar to the Kia Niro EV. Even the way it rides over bumps, it's surprisingly similar. I think that's all attributed to the fact that this car uses a wheelbase and a width that's pretty much identical. So that's pretty awesome. It's really amazing how similar the Niro and the Ioniq drive, handle, and ride. And I'm pleasantly surprised. I thought there would have been a bigger difference in terms of how they are, but feels like home. So what's my overall impression of the Ioniq Electric now that I've had a good look at it and I've driven the car? Well, I'm quite pleasantly surprised. The fact that the car is a sedan is going to be the major factor in terms of your decision, but it's also going to be the price. Now, the Ioniq Electric is about $10,000 less expensive in the ultimate trim than the Kia Niro EV. Now, other than some of the finished details on the interior of the car that are a little bit different, the biggest price difference comes from the fact that the Niro EV has a 64 kilowatt hour battery pack and a more powerful motor than the Ioniq, which has a 38 kilowatt hour battery pack. Now, that translates into a difference in range of about 100 kilometers. In my experience with my Niro, which is rated at 385 kilometers in Canada in terms of range on the website with Kia, I actually get about 400 in the summertime. Now, the Ioniq Electric, from the experience of the owner here, tells me that he gets about 300 kilometers in the summer with this car. So it's a question of range and style, and if you want that extra power as well. But ride comfort, this car is fantastic. Rear passenger room, almost identical except for the headroom. And for the trunk space, other than that sloped rear, it's actually surprisingly large. So it's up to you to choose which you prefer and what fits your budget. If you'd like me to make more videos comparing the Kia Niro EV to other electric cars, then put a comment below and let me know what make and model, not just Hyundai and Kia products, it can be any electric car, and I'll see if I can get a hold of one and make a review video about it. I'd like to say a big thank you to Fabien Moreau for having lent me his Ioniq to make this video on that beautiful sunny day. Today it's snowing. And I also want to say a big thank you to Robert Roll, who answered my request quickly to allow me to film with his car because I had forgotten to record the portion behind the driver's seat where I show you the dash and the shifter and all that other stuff. So thanks to both of you, I really appreciate your help in making this video. Now, just in case you didn't know, there are bloopers at the end of almost every video I've made since the end of 2019, so you're going to want to stick around to the end and have a look at those because some of them are kind of funny. And you might want to check out my previous videos because there's a lot of funny stuff where I make a fool of myself there too. And just in case you didn't know, I do have social media. I'll put links in the description below, and you can see the names here on the screen that are for Instagram pictures, so you can see all sorts of EV and non-EV related stuff, as well as my Facebook page where you can ask me questions and see articles to electric car related things. And I've got my website, which encapsulates a whole bunch of stuff that includes Instagram videos, links to products I've reviewed, etc. And I've also got a Ko-fi account, so if you feel like buying me a coffee on Ko-fi, I would appreciate it. Thank you very much if you already have, and thanks if you do. And once again, thanks for watching. Now, the DNA from those two cars is the same, but the platforms are different. The Hyundai Ioniq versus the Kona and the Soul, which are two cars that are related, that drive a little bit differently. That's a total piece of shit. I wanted to give you a view of the cars face to face. Shite. Has 16-inch wheels, but it's still fairly frack. Considering that the vehicle rides a little lower and has a body that sits a little bit lower, and that's a really annoying sound that I think is in the microphone. Now, that's not the case on the Ioniq. They have the smart idea of putting it on the back right of the car. If you watch my video about the Niro... If you watched my video about the things that I hate about my Kia Niro EV, and I'll put a link to that up here on the screen somewhere, because the Niro EV does have about 400 kilometers of range, whereas the Ioniq has, I don't remember because I never asked. Now, that difference in autonomy, frack. If you're interested in seeing more videos comparing the Kia Niro EV to other electric cars, please put a comment in the description below. If you'd like to see more videos comparing the Kia Niro EV to other makes and models of electric cars, then please put a comment in the description below. I keep doing that. If you'd like to see more videos of me comparing the Kia Niro EV to other makes and models of electric cars, not just Kia and Hyundai products, then put a description below. That avoids me having to do it. I've got a Facebook page where you can see news stuff and ask me questions and things like that. I've also got a web page that encapsulates pretty much... Encapsulates? It encapsulates. It's a good thing it doesn't encopulate.